I'm Dr. Erika Hanna, and I'm here today with Dr. Sam Grinsell, who teaches architectural history at UCL. And we're here to discuss Sam's recent article that's just been published in Urban History, entitled Urban History as Urgent Work, an Argument for Disciplinary Promiscuity. So, Sam, I was wondering if we could just start with you telling us a little about why you wrote this article.
Absolutely, great to be here, Erica. This article came out of the 2023 conference, 50 Years of Urban History, of the Urban History Journal at the University of Leicester, and I owe a debt to Andrew McTominay for organising a roundtable where we were discussing urban environmental history and its contributions, past and future. And I took that opportunity really to reflect on our positionality as a discipline, the politics of doing urban history in a time of climate crisis, and presented a short sort of few-minute presentation that became the core of this article, which has grown into a sort of larger position statement.
Great. So what is it the problem you identify with urban history that we need to think about?
I think it's a possibility that lies within urban history, but which we have sometimes resisted. We know that we're a very diverse discipline, people from many different historical fields and also other completely other disciplines contribute to our knowledge of the cities in the past and urbanization processes. And often urban historians, those writing in the Journal of Urban History or the Journal of Urban History, have attempted to delineate and sort of mark a clearer territory for some specific subfield that might be urban history. And the sort of fundamental argument that I'm trying to explore in this piece is what happens if we embrace that diversity and try to benefit from it rather than getting too worried about where the boundaries might lie. And I'm particularly thinking about the connection to the environmental humanities, which are often dealing with urban questions but often don't engage that much with urban historical scholarship.
And I think there's a really interesting moment to be thinking across urban history and environmental history. Can you tell us a bit more about how you conceive of that?
Yeah, I think that some of the most exciting urban historical work for me has always been emerging from the relationship with the environmental humanities, and going back some years we can think of William Cronin and Joel Tarr, but the person whose work has sort of particularly inspired me is Debjani Bhattacharya and her work on the history of Calcutta, which opens with this wonderful sentence, "This is a history of forgetting." And then she traces the history of that city through histories of cartography and land ownership and attempting to delineate the line between water and land in a delta environment and how that underpins the urban form. And I think that while that book has been welcomed and widely cited in both environmental history and urban history, I think the implications of that ability to think through land, sea, global colonial connections, and very rooted sense of place all at once is, I think there's sort of more to come from that, if you like. I think we need to take that kind of work and think directly, what does this allow us to do as urban historians that maybe we haven't done as much of, or maybe connects to audiences that we haven't thought of ourselves as connecting to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you talk about audiences, because that's what I wanted to ask you about next. Because in the article, it's really interesting how you talk about form and how we publish, where we publish. Can you tell us a bit more about how you think about sort of form and argument relating?
Absolutely. And this is related to sort of a wider sense of history itself as a discipline that attaches itself to some fairly conventional outputs that we usually imagine our work in. Perhaps this is especially in a UK context where we're used to thinking of research excellence framework and things like this. But the journal article has a sort of fairly distinct identity as a piece making an argument from some evidence. Quite often in historical articles, the innovation of that is that you found some evidence that someone hasn't previously written about before, or you're bringing together some pieces of evidence that haven't conventionally been thought of together. And that sits within academic journals and book chapters and things like that. And then you have the monograph, which is kind of a larger version of that, where we get to make our big interventions. And both of those are very valuable forms of output, and I wouldn't want to push against anything that exists. But we know that history is a huge area of human interest, right? People consume podcasts and television shows and dramas and YouTube videos about the past every day in huge numbers. And I mean, in some ways, I'm not making an original argument here. It behooves us to sort of take some role in that and to think about how we might contribute to those conversations. And I suppose maybe what I'm saying specifically is how those other forms might actually help us think historically, rather than thinking of them as the sort of popular output that you have some academic work happening over here and then you have some public facing work that happens over here. I'm interested in how, for example, like a historical television documentary might engage with space in a particular way, right? You know, if we think of TV historians often sort of go to a place and introduce us to that place as a way of opening up a conversation about the past. And I think that actually has potential for a sort of more profound way of thinking about past and place than perhaps we have realized or perhaps we have benefited from so far.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I also like the way you talked about like databases and online platforms as allowing us to think in a sort of more networked way, because they've got a more diffuse way of portraying knowledge. I really sort of appreciated that.
There's something also to think about, I suppose, in terms of style and collaboration, that again, there have been moves towards more collaboration in history and the humanities, although not so much as in the social sciences. But the outputs, again, have remained sort of relatively static things, whereas there are examples in the environmental humanities of people writing texts together where voice is kind of shared across sentences, and the reader can tell that multiple authors have constructed this text, but you can't reconstruct who said what. And that seems to me to be a distinctive and potentially productive way of moving beyond the kind of restrictions of conventional thinking or writing.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, like especially as like the scales of urban history change, like to allow this kind of multiplicity and discord, which we know is characteristic of the city and city networks throughout history, to think about how we portray that through form is really interesting. Which brings me on to my next question, which is a question about scale. Like, if this is a moment when you are arguing for new ways of doing history, to urban history, to answer new questions, then what scales do you think we should do that through?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's very much a relationship between this point about form and the argument about scale. And I am very interested in planetary ways of thinking and working. Actually, yesterday I was at an event at the IHR that was the first of their seminars that will explore this question of planetary histories from a few different methodological starting points. And I think the planetary may be the space, the scale, the mode of thinking that allows urban historians to fully rejoin conversations within environmental history and global history. There has been a tendency to want to produce histories at distinct scales, where you have sort of big history that might be thinking about the globe or thinking about the Atlantic or thinking about a continent, and then you have smaller individual histories, and the relationship between these is sort of an assumed thing. I think some of the most interesting work really moves between those scales at once and begins to think about how the planetary connections play out in very specific ways in very specific places. So the materiality of fishing, for example, is something that I'm working on at present, where if you start from a sort of fish market in London and start tracing the connections between that place and other places, taking seriously the practices and infrastructures at each of those places, then you end up with a much more dispersed sense of where the city is coming from, as it were, of what's generating the city. And I think that's important for us to bring into urban history, and that it's an important contribution that urban historians can make.
I like this idea of thinking across differing scales, and like somehow not losing the texture of the particular, but also having that kind of political power to think globally. I think that's really exciting. So the big question, I suppose, is taking all these interventions and ideas, and actually your article is full of suggestions and ideas. Where do you think urban history should go now?
I mean, of course, I think that some of these ideas should be taken up and taken forward. I do want to say here, and I say in the article, that that's what I view as a sort of additive point. It's not that I want urban history to do this and to do less of something else. I think, though, that that does put certain demands on us as scholars. I think being able to think about connections and comparisons both at the same time is an important planetary move. And that means being willing to read across wider literatures to connect our work, both to places that we don't study and to methodologies that maybe we're not entirely familiar with, but to take some kind of confidence into that the material that we spend our time thinking about in terms of planning documents, oral histories, diary accounts, travel accounts, these sort of things that we are used to combing through in order to understand particular places, can help us then take conversations into an environmental humanities conversation that is often pitched in much larger terms about what humanity is and how it relates to the world. And I think we have something to say within that. So part of the point that I'm trying to make here is to sort of hand some confidence back to urban historians and say, we know particular things that can be useful for understanding human relations to the world at large.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And just on that point, so are you taking these ideas forward in your own research? What are you working on next?
Yeah, I gave a little snippet of sort of thinking through fish, and my current monograph that I'm working on attempts to do some of this in that it brings together kind of 3 specific historical studies, one looking at histories of enslavement, and one looking at histories of fishing, and one looking at histories of migration, and thinks about those 3 processes through the space of the southern North Sea. So one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in pursuing, and that others might want to take up, is how, if we shift our focus away from individual cities or from the nation state and go to sort of what you might call ecological groupings. So in this case, the southern North Sea is a very distinctive land seascape where the coasts of Belgium, the Netherlands, and England sort of look similar to each other. And it is also a sort of nexus of power in the world in the 19th century. And to begin to think about the entanglements that area brings out. The purpose of doing that is to allow us to think about how land and sea and environment play a role in the production of lives and spaces and histories without only tracing the history of kind of institutions, which a lot of environmental and urban history often becomes histories of particular institutions or scientific knowledges or reports or things like this. And I'm interested in taking areas that are not, as it were, sort of not assembled and doing a historical work of assembling them.
Great. Okay, I look forward to reading it. Oh, that's all. So thanks very much, Sam. We'll ever look forward to reading the article in Urban History.
Thanks so much, Erika.